The Army Corps of Engineers plans to slow down releases from Lake Okeechobee starting today. Releases had been as high as 6 billion gallons of water a day.
When the Army Corps of Engineers finally pulled the plug.
Happening today, the Army Corps of Engineers will ramp up water releases from Lake Okeechobee, this time to the west coast of Florida.
Lake Okeechobee didn't just get shallower, it gave up its secrets. As the water retreated, drone footage caught something bizarre, a massive rhythmic shifting in the mud that looked less like earth and more like a living skin. This wasn't just a discovery of old shipwrecks or lost relics. It was a waking giant, a moving mystery that proved the Big O still has the power to shock us all. The stirring in the muck. To understand what was captured on that grainy drone footage, you have to first understand that Lake Okeechobee isn't like other lakes. It's a massive, shallow saucer of tea-colored water, and when the levels drop, the world changes. As the water retreated during the recent drawdown, the cameras didn't just find sand. They found a shifting, undulating carpet that seemed to breathe. At first glance, it looked like the mud itself was crawling. The movement that nobody expected wasn't a single creature or a prehistoric monster. It was a literal explosion of life that had been suppressed by high water for years. It was a massive, synchronized crawl of millions of native apple snails and the frantic boiling movement of the Big O's fish population being squeezed into tighter and tighter corridors. But the most unsettling visual, the one that went viral, was the shifting islands. As the water depth plummeted to record lows, massive sections of the lake's bottom, layers of peat and organic muck that had been submerged for decades, began to float and move. These are known as tussocks. Imagine a piece of land the size of a school bus suddenly detaching from the earth and drifting across a mudflat. To a drone pilot, it looked like the lake bed was breaking apart and walking away. Underneath these floating islands, the footage revealed a writhing mass of life. Thousands of Florida gar, bowfin, and alligators were forced into the remaining deep water trails. From the air, these trails looked like black veins pumping through the gray-brown mud. The movement was constant. If you stood on the edge of the Herbert Hoover Dike and looked out with binoculars, the horizon didn't look solid. It looked like a liquid desert, constantly vibrating as the ecosystem struggled to recalibrate to its new, smaller footprint. For those who live on the lake, the sight was eerie. We are used to seeing a vast horizon of blue water, but the footage showed a landscape that looked more like the surface of a distant, swampy planet. The moving elements were a wake-up call. It was a reminder that the lake isn't just a reservoir. It's a living, breathing, biological machine. The movement wasn't a sign of death, but a sign of a massive, forced migration happening in real time. As the muck moved and the snails crawled, the predators followed. The footage caught hundreds of snail kites, rare hooked-beak raptors, descending on the moving mud. It was a feeding frenzy of a scale rarely seen in the 21st century. The birds were so thick in the air that they looked like a cloud of smoke rising from the lake bed. This was the secret the lowering water revealed. When you take away the depth, you reveal the raw, unfiltered intensity of Florida's food chain. The sheer volume of movement was what caught people off guard. When you look at a full lake, you see a calm surface. When you look at a drained Lake Okeechobee, you see the struggle for survival. You see the invasive pythons slithering through the new land. You see the ancient turtles trekking miles to find the receding shoreline. And you see the massive beds of eelgrass waving in the wind like a field of wheat, where there used to be 10 feet of water. This narrative of movement wasn't just about biology. It was about history. As the mud shifted and the water left, the moving things also included the wreckage of the past. Old fishing boats, long forgotten and buried in the silt, were suddenly pushed to the surface by the gases trapped in the mud. To an observer, it looked like the lake was literally vomiting up the 20th century. One specific piece of footage showed the rusted hull of a 1940s-era tractor appearing to rise out of a dry patch over the course of 3 days, as the surrounding muck dehydrated and sank. The mystery of the moving lake bed became a local legend overnight. People spoke of muck fires that could travel underground and ghost islands that appeared in the morning and vanished by dusk. But the scientific reality was even more impressive. This movement was the lake cleaning its lungs. By exposing the bottom to the sun and air, the organic matter began to break down. The shifting was the sound and sight of a massive chemical and biological reset. For the first time in a generation, the Big O was showing its true face. It wasn't the face of a stagnant pond, but the face of a wild, churning river sea that refused to sit still. The drone footage served as a bridge between the myth of the monster in the lake and the reality of a massive, complex ecosystem fighting to stay alive in a man-made world. Every ripple in the mud and every sliding tussock was a heartbeat. Watching the footage, you couldn't help but feel a sense of smallness. We think we control the lake with our dikes, our gates, and our pumps. But as the moving mud showed, the lake has a life of its own. It is a world of shadows, scales, and shifting silt that operates on a timeline much older than our engineering projects. The movement below wasn't just one thing. It was everything. It was the collective spirit of the Everglades, squeezed into a 700-square-mile bowl, finally getting a chance to stretch its legs as the water fell away. Beyond the strange movements in the mud lies a much larger story about the Big O itself, a giant that dominates the Florida Peninsula. The anatomy of a giant, Lake Okeechobee's depth and detail. To understand why the movement in the muck was so startling, you have to realize that Lake Okeechobee is an anomaly.
Lake Okeechobee is the second largest freshwater lake completely contained in the United States.
It is the largest freshwater lake in the southern United States, covering roughly 730 square miles. If you stood in the center, you wouldn't see land in any direction. You would swear you were in the middle of the ocean. Yet, if you jumped overboard, you might not even get your hair wet. That is the great paradox of the Big O. It is a vast, liquid empire that is almost impossibly shallow. On average, Lake Okeechobee is only 9 feet deep. At its absolute deepest points, usually near the center or within the rim canal, it might hit 12 to 15 feet, depending on the season. Because it is shaped like a giant, shallow saucer, even a tiny drop in water levels exposes massive tracts of the lake bed. When the Army Corps of Engineers manages the lake,
The Army Corps of Engineers plans to slow down releases from Lake Okeechobee starting today.
they aren't just moving water. They are playing a high-stakes game of inches. A 1-foot drop in the water level can retreat the shoreline by hundreds of yards in certain areas, turning a boat ramp into a mud pit overnight. The bottom of the lake isn't just sand and rock. It's a complex layering of geological history. Most of the lake sits on a bed of limestone, but over thousands of years, the decay of plants and the runoff from the Kissimmee River have created a thick layer of organic muck. This muck is the consistency of chocolate pudding and can be several feet deep. It is nutrient-rich, but also problematic. Because the lake is so shallow, a stiff breeze can stir the bottom up to the surface. This is why the lake often looks like chocolate milk rather than a clear blue spring. This phenomenon, known as turbidity, is a major factor in the lake's health. When the water is murky, sunlight can't reach the bottom to grow the plants that provide oxygen and habitat. The lake acts as the liquid heart of Florida. It sits at the center of a massive watershed that starts all the way up near Orlando. Rainwater flows down the Kissimmee River into the lake, and from there, it's supposed to flow south into the Everglades. However, because of the way we've engineered the state, the lake is now a managed reservoir. It provides drinking water for millions of people, irrigation for a billion-dollar sugar and vegetable industry, and a multi-million-dollar playground for bass fishermen. When the footage showed the moving lake bed, it was a rare glimpse into the benthic zone, the very bottom of the food chain. This area is usually hidden under feet of dark water. Seeing it dry and exposed was like looking at the internal organs of a giant. You could see the ancient ridges formed by currents, the shells of millions of prehistoric mollusks, and the way the limestone floor creates natural bowls that hold water long after the rest of the lake has dried up. These deep holes are the bunkers where the lake's life hides during a drought. The detail of the lake's geography is also defined by its shelves. The western marsh is the biological engine of the lake. This is a massive area of grasses and lily pads that acts as a natural filter. When the lake is high, the water stays out in the pelagic or open water zone. When it's low, like in the footage, the marsh becomes the primary focus. This is where the moving life was most concentrated. The interaction between the limestone floor, the organic muck, and the shallow water creates a chemical cocktail that is both incredibly productive and incredibly fragile. One of the most surprising details about the lake's anatomy is its perched nature. Because of the muck accumulation and the way the surrounding land has sunk due to farming, the lake actually sits higher than some of the land around it. This means that if the walls weren't there, the lake would naturally spill out in every direction. It is a body of water, held in place by sheer human will and millions of tons of rock and dirt. The scale of the lake is hard to grasp until you see it empty. You begin to see the trails carved by airboats over decades, looking like scars on the earth. You see the remnants of old islands that were submerged when the lake was first dammed. The detail of the lake isn't just in its water, but in the memory of the land beneath it. Every time the water is lowered, the lake's anatomy tells a story of how Florida used to look before the first shovel ever hit the dirt. A sprawling, marshy sea that knew no boundaries. The movement we saw in the footage was simply the lake's anatomy trying to return to its natural state. Without the weight of billions of gallons of water pressing down, the skin of the lake, the plants, the muck, and the creatures could finally breathe. It was a reminder that while we can map every inch of the Big O with sonar and satellites, the lake still has depths, both literal and metaphorical, that we are only beginning to understand. While the anatomy of the lake is a wonder of nature, the massive walls holding that water in place are a testament to a much darker and more dangerous history. A history of walls and water, the Herbert Hoover Dike. To understand why we have the power to lower the lake and reveal these mysteries at all, you have to look back at a time when Lake Okeechobee was a wild, untamed sea with no borders. Before the 1920s, the lake didn't have a plug. When the summer rains came, the Big O would simply swell until it overflowed its southern lip, sending a shallow, 50-mile-wide sheet flow of water crawling toward the Florida Bay. This was the birth of the Everglades. But as settlers moved in to farm the rich black gold soil south of the lake, that natural rhythm became a death sentence. The history of the lake's walls is written in tragedy. In 1926, a massive hurricane hit Miami.
The 1926 Miami hurricane is the only example we have of a Category 4 hurricane.
And moved inland, pushing the lake's water over its small hand-built muck dikes and killing hundreds. But that was just a warning. In 1928, a monstrous Category 4 hurricane slammed directly into the lake. The wind acted like a giant hand, pushing the water out of the shallow basin and creating a massive storm surge. In a matter of hours, over 2,500 people, mostly migrant farm workers, were drowned as a wall of water swept through the towns of Belle Glade and Pahokee. It remains one of the deadliest natural disasters in American history. In the wake of that horror, the federal government decided the lake had to be caged. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was brought in to build what would become the Herbert Hoover Dike. This isn't just a simple fence. It is a 143-mile-long earthen fortress that completely encircles the lake. Construction began in the 1930s and continued for decades, eventually resulting in a massive embankment that stands about 30 feet high. This wall effectively turned Lake Okeechobee into a giant bathtub, disconnected from its natural flow and controlled by a series of massive gates, pumps, and locks. For nearly a century, this dike has been the only thing standing between the lake and the destruction of South Florida. But cages have a way of aging. By the early 2000s, the dike was considered one of the most at-risk structures in the country. Because it was built mostly of gravel, sand, and shells, water began to seep through the bottom of the wall. If you walked along the outside of the dike during high water, you could see boils, places where the lake's pressure was literally forcing water up through the ground on the other side. The fear of a total collapse led to a massive multi-billion-dollar rehabilitation project that was only recently completed. This history is why the movement in the mud is so significant. For almost 100 years, we kept the lake high to protect the farms and keep the water flowing to the cities. But keeping the water high meant the lake's internal ecosystem was being drowned. The plants couldn't get sunlight, and the muck just kept building up. By lowering the lake today, engineers are trying to undo some of the damage caused by a century of containment. They are giving the lake a reset that hasn't happened naturally since before the 1928 storm. The dike changed the soul of the lake. It turned a sprawling marsh into a managed reservoir. Today, when you see those shifting islands and moving mudflats in the footage, you are seeing a glimpse of what the lake looked like before the walls went up. The history of the Herbert Hoover Dike is a story of human survival, but it's also a story of how we traded the health of the ecosystem for the safety of our towns. Every time a gate is opened or a pump is turned on, it is a reminder of that 1928 tragedy. We manage the Big O with a heavy hand because we remember what happens when the water wins. But the drone footage shows us that the lake is still trying to be a living thing, even within its cage. The walls keep the people safe, but the lowering of the water allows the lake itself to survive. It is a delicate, dangerous balance that defines the very existence of modern Florida. With the walls secured and the water lowered, the focus shifts from engineering back to the environment and the complex, often messy world of the lake's modern ecosystem. The pulse of the glades, the ecosystem, and the conflict. If the dike is the cage, then the ecosystem of Lake Okeechobee is the wild spirit within it, perpetually at odds with the bars that hold it. For decades, the pulse of the glades, the natural rhythmic flow of water from the lake to the southern marshes, has been more of a stutter. When you saw that footage of the lake being lowered, you weren't just seeing a drought. You were seeing a surgical attempt to save a dying patient. The biggest threat to the Big O isn't the lack of water. It's what is in the water. For nearly a century, agricultural runoff from the north has pumped the lake full of phosphorus and nitrogen. These nutrients act like a super fuel for the lake's most notorious resident, blue-green algae, cyanobacteria. When the water is high and the sun is hot, the lake can turn into a 700 square mile bowl of toxic green soup. This isn't just an eyesore, it's an environmental crisis that can kill fish, poison pets, and even threaten human health. The mystery of the moving mud in the footage is directly tied to this struggle. When the water level stays high for too long, the lake's submerged aquatic vegetation, SAV, plants like eelgrass and pondweed, dies off because sunlight can't reach the bottom. Without these plants to act as the lake's lungs, the water becomes even more turbid and toxic. By lowering the lake in 2025 and 2026, engineers are performing a reset. They are exposing the bottom to the air and sun, which allows these critical grasses to germinate. That moving carpet of green we saw in the drone footage, that was the sound of the lake starting to breathe again. This restoration comes with a heavy price and a fierce conflict. When the water is lowered, it has to go somewhere. Historically, it would have drifted south into the Everglades. Today, much of it is diverted through the St. Lucie and Caloosahatchee rivers to the coasts. These discharges carry the lake's pollutants with them, often sparking massive algae blooms at the beaches. This creates a heartbreaking tug-of-war. Do we save the lake's ecosystem by draining it, even if it harms the coastal estuaries? Or do we keep the lake high and let its internal heart rot? In the middle of this conflict is a small, hooked-beak bird called the Everglades snail kite. This endangered raptor is the canary in the coal mine for the lake. It eats almost exclusively native apple snails, which can only thrive when the water levels are just right. If the lake is too high, the snails drown. If it's too low, they dry out. The moving life caught on camera, the millions of snails crawling through the mud, is the dinner plate for this rare bird. When the lake is lowered strategically, as it was in early 2025, we see a massive boom in the snail kite population. It is a sign that, despite all our meddling, the ecosystem still knows how to heal itself if given the chance. But the pulse is still faint. To truly fix the lake, we have to restore the sheet flow, the ability for water to move south through the Everglades Agricultural Area, EAA, and into the River of Grass. Massive projects like the EAA Reservoir, currently under construction as we head into 2026, are designed to finally bypass the old canal systems. The goal is to take that nutrient-rich water, clean it in massive stormwater treatment areas, and send it south where it belongs. The footage of the waking giant showed us that the ecosystem isn't dead, it's just suppressed. Every time the mud shifts and a new patch of eelgrass breaks the surface, the lake is trying to tell us that it's ready to work with us. The conflict between farmers, environmentalists, and coastal residents is intense. But the Big O doesn't care about politics. It only cares about the balance of light, life, and the flow of the water. As we look at the shifting mud and the returning birds, we have to wonder what comes next. The mystery of the moving lake bed wasn't an ending, but a new beginning for the heart of Florida. The future of the Big O, 2026 and beyond. As we stand in the early days of 2026, the drone footage that first captured those mysterious movements in the mud is no longer just a viral sensation.
Okeechobee may have reached its highest water level in 12 years, but a recent inspection by the Army Corps of Engineers shows there's no concerns or issues.
It's a historical record of a turning point. The moving lake bed was the opening act for a new era in Florida's water management. Today, the Lake Okeechobee we are looking at is arguably the most monitored, engineered, and debated piece of nature on the planet. But for the first time in a century, the plan isn't just to control the lake, it's to let it heal. The biggest shift has come from the full implementation of LOSOM, the Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual, which officially took the reins in late 2024 and is now the brain of the lake in 2026. Under the old rules, the Army Corps of Engineers was forced to treat the lake like a simple reservoir. If the water got too high, they dumped it east and west, devastating the coastal estuaries with chocolate milk runoff and toxic algae. Under LOSOM, that rigid thinking is gone. Water managers now have the flexibility to prioritize the health of the lake's ecosystem, sending vastly more water south to the Everglades, where it is desperately needed, rather than choking the coasts. This new flexibility is what allowed for the recovery operations that exposed the lake bed in the first place. By intentionally allowing the lake to drop to lower levels during the dry seasons of 2024 and 2025, managers gave the Big O a chance to perform a biological reset. In 2026, we are seeing the results. The moving carpets of eelgrass and pondweed that were just tiny sprouts in the mud a year ago have now matured into massive underwater forests. These forests act as a natural filter, trapping the muck and cleaning the water from the bottom up. But the future isn't just about rules. It's about massive infrastructure finally coming online. As of January 2026, the EAA Reservoir, Everglades Agricultural Area, is no longer a distant dream. The massive inflow pump stations, capable of moving billions of gallons of water a day, have broken ground or are entering testing phases. This reservoir is the missing link that will allow the lake to exhale its water south into the River of Grass after it has been cleaned of phosphorus. The mystery has also evolved into a story of ecological resurgence. The snail kite, once on the brink of vanishing from the lake, has seen a banner year in 2025. And as we move through 2026, the moving snails they depend on are thriving in the newly restored marshes. The commercial and recreational fisheries are also seeing a rebound effect. The black crappie and largemouth bass seasons are predicted to be among the best in a decade, fueled by the healthy habitat that the lowering of the lake helped create. However, the Big O is never truly out of the woods. In 2026, we still face the looming threat of climate change and the legacy phosphorus buried in the silt. The lake is a patient in recovery, not a patient that is cured. There will still be years when the blue-green algae tries to take over, and there will still be heated political battles over who gets the water during a drought. But the difference today is that we are no longer flying blind. The drone footage that shocked the world showed us that the lake is a living, breathing entity that responds to the right care. The something moving that nobody expected turned out to be the most hopeful thing of all: resilience. The lake bed wasn't dying, it was waiting. It was waiting for the water to drop, for the sun to hit the mud, and for the humans to finally realize that the liquid heart of Florida needs to beat at its own rhythm. As we look forward to the rest of 2026 and beyond, the story of Lake Okeechobee is no longer a tragedy of walls and floods, but a narrative of restoration. The giant is awake. It's moving. And for the first time in a long time, it's moving in the right direction. The secret in plain sight. The grainy drone footage that first captured those rhythmic, undulating movements in the exposed muck of Lake Okeechobee did more than just spark a viral mystery. It pulled back the curtain on the most significant ecological reset in Florida's modern history. What people initially mistook for something monstrous or unexplained was, in fact, the sight of a waking giant. As we've navigated through the start of 2026, it has become clear that the moving lake bed was the literal heartbeat of a recovering wilderness, a visual confirmation that the Big O is not a static reservoir, but a dynamic living entity that has been waiting for the chance to breathe.
Living here means this, that, or the other because
Right.
we live in a delicate
That's
ecosystem
exactly right.
called Florida, the
Right.
Everglades, especially south of Orlando.
This revelation has fundamentally changed how we view the relationship between human engineering and the natural world. For a century, we believed that safety meant caging the lake behind 143 miles of rock and dirt, keeping the water high and the secrets hidden. But as the recovery operations of the last 2 years have shown, a lake kept in a permanent state of high water stagnation is a lake that eventually loses its soul. The movement in the mud, the crawling snails, the shifting vegetation, and the return of rare raptors proved that the lake's greatest strength isn't its volume, but its resilience. As we look toward the future, the lessons learned from the Big O's exposed floor are being written into the next chapter of Florida's history. With the new LAWSOM operating rules and the massive EAA reservoir projects nearing completion, the goal is no longer just to prevent another 1928 tragedy, but to restore the sheet flow that once defined the entire peninsula. We are finally moving away from the era of discharging water as waste and toward a future where we treat every drop as the lifeblood of the Everglades. Ultimately, the something moving below that nobody expected wasn't a threat. It was a promise. It was a promise that even after a century of pollution, hurricanes, and heavy-handed management, the heart of Florida still knows how to beat. The mystery of Lake Okeechobee has been solved not by finding a monster, but by finding a future. One where the walls remain strong, but the water finally finds its way home. The mystery of the Big O is far from over, and as the waters continue to shift, we'll be here to track every discovery. If you want more stories of hidden wonders and mysteries, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell.